Please welcome back Felicity Hassan, who will be moderating our second panel on diversity with purpose.
All right, well, we were so excited about all the things that we had to say about DEI and it giving us a competitive advantage that we had to create two panels in order to kind of make sure that we had got all of the great ideas out there. I hope you're taking notes. I certainly was in the last panel. That really was fantastic stuff. So I want to shift a little bit. I want us to start thinking about like really kind of influencing the CEO, influencing the boardroom. So in this panel, we're going to be starting to think about leaders who get it. So this is how chief diversity officers are really kind of working closely with their CEO and their leadership team to really affect change. So I'm very excited to welcome our guests and similar concept. I'd like all of you to give just a little bit of an introduction about yourself, your role, and again, how like your passion for DEI led you to this table.
All right, I see you looking at me, so I will go first.
I am.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Khalil Smith. I'm the Vice President of Inclusion, Diversity, and Engagement at Akamai Technologies, which is about a 10,000 person company, global company headquartered out of Cambridge, Massachusetts, but we've got offices in Bangalore and Krakow, and post-pandemic, we have folks all over the place, as I'm sure many of us do. My passion for this really stemmed from trying to better understand myself as a leader. So if I go back about 25 years, I started to recognize I was working in retail at the time, and I recognized that any time that someone came in that was kind of about 5'10", dark-skinned African-American guy, he got my best. And I was like, he reminds me of my father. That's why this is happening over and over and over again. I'm nicer, I'm kinder, I'm doing more. And that led me down a path of trying to understand bias and inclusion and diversity and where are all of the other places that this is influencing my point of view and my leadership and the way that I show up and the way that I engage others. And that has taken quite a path over that period of time to just better understanding how I show up and then how I can support others. And I think very much in line with this conversation, how I can hopefully build better systems to help influence others.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Joanne.
Next. Good morning, everyone. First, I'd like to thank Wells Fargo for hosting Diligent and Edie WBC for putting this really important discussion together today. I'm Joanne Dowdell. I'm the Senior Vice President for Newscorp. We're headquartered here in New York. I am in their Government Affairs Office in Washington, D.C. And my path here, or my passion, I do not have a specific DEI role within the company, but I do serve on the board of Green America. I'm an employee-elected board member, and I co-chair their Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee. And I am also a trustee for Bay Atlantic University and am on the Academic Affairs Committee, and diversity and inclusion is top on our agenda as a board. My real passion, though, is as an African-American woman, I have often been the only one in the room or at the table. And I have been very curious about the differences about women advancing, people of color advancing, and some of the challenges that we face. And how much progress have we or have we not made? I find that the fight can also be had within the organization, if you will. So while it needs to start from the top, I think you need to push from within, and that's how I see my role. I will just say, as a point of interest, I was a senior vice president and director of corporate responsibility for a socially responsible asset management firm in New Hampshire, and in that role, I had a shareholder activist role. So I think what I can bring to the table today is sort of the perspective of your stakeholders and shareholders and why this issue is so critically important and the work that we're all doing is so vital right now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joanne. I think you're doing quite a lot in this area.
So you had me go after
Yeah.
Joanne. Hi, I'm Shelley McNamara. I'm the Chief Equality and Inclusion Officer for Procter & Gamble, otherwise known as P&G. We are an $80 billion company headquartered in Cincinnati, Ohio. We have about 100,000 employees that operate in about 80 countries around the world. There's really, it's like three pieces to this puzzle, I would say, about how I ended up in the role that I am in, that I love so much. First is it's a combination of education, experience, and life. So for me, that's my journey, and I love hearing everyone's journey because they're all a bit unique, and yet they brought us to some similar points where we want to drive change, and we are driving change. But for me, it was, I have both a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in organizational development and organizational behavior, so the art of change, the science of change, it was just, that formed the basis, I would say. And through that education, I was exposed to just some really, really smart people and some wonderful experiences. The second piece is I'm an HR professional through P&G. So I've been with P&G for 35 years. I was 10. I was 10. And I used to be about 6 feet tall. So I'm going to talk to you about that. This work can be challenging. But I came through HR, but as a transformational leader. So I really ended up working on a range of small projects and then large projects, and worked in small organizations and then larger organizations right next to the person who was leading the P&L to drive transformation and change in a range of ways. And then third, I would say life. Life has brought me here. So my wife and I have 3 daughters. All 3 of our daughters are in their 20s. Being a same-sex couple in the late 90s in Cincinnati, Ohio, having our first daughter was not the easiest of journeys. But what it did do for me along the way was build a level of insight and compassion and empathy for how it feels, because I say, I have a life of privilege and not privilege. I can change my clothes and go somewhere with my wife and I'm treated one way, and I can dress up after work and walk in and look like the executive and be treated another way. And so my understanding and my empathy. So anyway, it's been a combination of that, and the OD background really framed me and my mind and my mental models around strategy, structure, systems, culture, people, and working through how do you drive change in an integrated and holistic way. So both my passion and my work life today is about doing that with colleagues around the world, a few who are here with me today, to figure out how do we drive holistic and integrated change in this space. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you. And Lindsey.
Same.
Just say ditto.
That's the only thing that will follow, right? No, okay. Just joking. Nice to see everyone. Lindsey McClain here from IBM. And I will give you my full title because I'm up here with a lot more illustrious folks than I am myself. But I am the Director of Diversity and Inclusion of Strategic Development and Organizational Capability, which I think with your OD background you would probably appreciate. Thinking about the combination of organizational capacity and capability and how that really allows or encourages us to integrate our D&I strategy into everything that we do from an overall talent and people perspective. So that's been my privilege to be able to kind of anchor my focus in the D&I space in ways to make it a skill, right? How do we approach diversity and inclusion as something that's expected of all of us and that is as fluent as we've seen other ways of working become more popular over the past couple of years, things like agile design and design thinking. We talk about stand-ups and squads, and we should talk about, I think, inclusion and diversity in similar ways. And so that's where I've been able to anchor my focus under the leadership of our Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer, who's Carla Grant-Pickens, another leader that I'll be able to speak about as one that gets it a little bit differently than those on the panel. In terms of my passion for the space, it's interesting. I dare say this. I don't typically say this in rooms, but I feel safe here. Diversity and inclusion was not something that I had on my long-term kind of career path. As an African American female growing up in New York City, I felt that was my experience, and therefore that was who I was as a professional and as a personal person. And so, it was strategy for me. It had to be deep in the business structure. It had to be really HR strategic advisor. That's what I knew it had to be in order for me to feel comfortable. Over the years, I was awakened and been made very clear to the fact that this is exactly that, right? That this has to be treated that way in order for us to see the progress that we're looking for. And so as I moved through various organizations and ended up at IBM, I really saw the opportunity to bring that personal and professional experience into one kind of combined effort from me. Similarly, growing up in New York City, I went to the Dalton School. If any of you guys are from New York, it's probably like a symbol for privilege. But grew up in the Bronx, in the South Bronx, which is probably a symbol for anything but privilege. And so that duality of my life, I talk about all the time as the thing that I really think has given me perspective, and that's what I try to bring to the table every day. And that's me.
Fantastic.
So excited to be here.
Excellent. Well, look, we started talking about, and I'm Felicity Hassan for anyone who joined, but you probably all heard this. So for anyone who's listening into the last panel, we started talking about the role of the Chief Diversity Officer and just anyone who's adjacent to diversity in organizations being this influencer in chief, this person who constantly has to help guide the conversation, the diplomat in the room. And I wanted to kind of take that conversation that we started in the last panel and kind of take it one step further and start thinking about, right, okay, as the influencer in chief, how have you worked with your CEO, or how have you helped influence the leadership team and their thinking about the diversity in the boardroom as well? So, Shelley, do you want to kick us off with that?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Life happens in chapters, right? And there are moments in those chapters where you're like, oh, this one will have some significance down the road. I'm not exactly sure what, right? And so I had you could say it's a coincidence, but it was a privilege for me. I was a senior HR vice president working for David Taylor, who ran our health and grooming business. David became the CEO and just recently retired. And while I was working with David, one of the things that I had the opportunity to do was to lead and drive a range of change efforts in his organization as his senior HR leader. And in addition to that year I gave a pretty big speech in front of all of P&G, sharing my life story and what that journey has been as the most senior open lesbian at P&G, member of the LGBTQ community, having a wife and daughters, and where the barriers and challenges and risks and things that happen along the way. And I told this story on a stage, and David saw me, and he came to that and watched that. And it was after that experience where he heard me speak through storytelling about what happens when you're a member of a marginalized community and how that you can be alienated or eliminated systemically, culturally, et cetera. And he said to me, have you ever thought about considering, developing yourself for this role of the Chief Diversity Officer one day? And I looked straight at him and I said, no, I hadn't. And he said, well, I think you should, And so for me, the reason I share that is I had the benefit as I moved into this position of being with somebody who had a whole bunch of people help open his eyes and his mind and his heart about what work needed to be done. I was only one of the people on that journey, but a whole bunch of people. So that when he came into the role of CEO, he put me in the role. He knew that what I wanted to do was to drive more change, and he was supportive of that. So I think, that you talk about influencer in chief, you have to work with especially the most senior person who is always the CEO, somebody who wants to drive change. And then your job is to continue to enlighten them and reinforce them. Now, I'll tell you the second thing that had to be true for the progress we've made at P&G in this role of influencer in chief for me. The second thing is that there are a number of leaders. This work doesn't happen in a silo. So I don't drive all of the work at P&G in the space of DE&I. Not even close. There are a number but there were key people in key positions who ensured that we started and we launched really, really critical work. One piece of work that we launched back almost 7 years ago now was work to transform our talent systems. And I worked on that with the head of talent for the company. And one of the things that I was able to do was to work with a team to say, how do we start to shift and reshape our whole talent system so that we build outstanding and diverse leadership at every level in the company, that we build a pipeline of outstanding and diverse leadership. And that sounds very generic, but we built a really robust strategy underneath that. At the same time, there was a really powerful group of people who were saying we need to drive gender equality. There were a really powerful group of people saying we need to drive LGBTQ equality. People saying we need to drive racial equality. And so we were transforming this talents engine of the company, and it included setting really specific targets. So when you talk about the board, one of the things that we set was really specific targets that we aligned all the way up through the CEO and through to the board of directors of the company. It's very specific targets we wanted to reach by 2020. You know, and we've made enormous progress against a number of those. So today we have managers at P&G. We're now 49.5% female. So 49.5% of the, and we were 7 points less than that when we started this journey. Just for one data point out. Today, 50% of our board of directors is female. We have 36% of our, I'm going to get this wrong unless I do this right, of our executive leadership team is women and 46% multicultural. So we set specific targets, we set specific plans, and then, thank you. And there are people who ensured, now one last piece on this, influencer in chief, because I moved into the role about 3.5 years ago. There were pockets of work that were going on. I got to lead one of those big pockets of work called talent transformation with another colleague. But what I had the benefit of doing was working then with colleagues all around the world to say, we have this amazing work going on. Now how do we bring it together and put on paper a holistic and integrated strategy that shows how it both fits together and drives some common outcomes or impact. And that's where we've generated a whole nother wave of momentum. So I get really excited about this. So
yeah, it's really impressive.
We can't tell.
But but for good reason. Those are great stats.
Yeah.
But also I think one of the things which I took from your input there was really the personal story. And I feel like David became like more engaged and more excited about like the prospect of what could potentially be achieved because you were honest, you were candid, you were vulnerable, you kind of put yourself out there in terms of like, hey, and it probably made it like a little bit more tangible for him and thinking about like, right, okay, this is actually something that that we could really be thinking about like more systematically, more strategically, and we'll go a little bit deeper on that in a minute when we start talking about leaders who get it. But like, I'd love to hear a little bit more from this side on like, how you're influencing leadership, how you're influencing like the CEO and the boardroom.
I'll start with that. So Newscorp is Dow Jones, the Wall Street Journal, HarperCollins Book Publishing, News UK, and Newscorp Australia. We are a global media company and information services company. Our CEO, Robert Thompson, I have to say, is intellectually curious and passionate about the work of the company and having relationships with our stakeholders and the communities where we operate. He's also very passionate about having a diverse talent pool in the organization, so I'll run off some stats as well. Women represent 47% of our employees. We have somewhat less than 8,000 globally. And of that, they also represent 30% of the company's senior leadership. And on our board, we have 9 members, 33% are women, and 4 members self-identify as Asian, Latin, Hispanic, or 2 or more races or ethnicities. Through our HR department, one of the things that I have had the pleasure of being able to do is to work with our HR professionals, and in positions that we're hiring in our department, I suggested that, you should really speak to some of the executives and the employees about their own networks. I am part of a Black Girl Magic network in Washington, D.C., and we have a job share. So if they're jobs, I say, send me the jobs and I'll put them out to our network. And that kind of kills we don't know where to look. We don't know where to go. And
I love that. I love that.
Because there-
Where did
if-
you start? Is
Right,
usually my answer to
exactly.
that.
did
Where have you looked so far?
Where have you looked? And they have done a really good job with the outreach and recruitment. As far as the retention side, I can say that they really value the institutional knowledge of employees. And so on our annual goals activity, one of the questions that they ask is, what are you passionate about and what are your interests? Would you be interested in relocating? If so, where? So now you're building a relationship with your employees, and I think that really has become one of the hallmarks of News Corporation. And I would say you just can't always judge a book by its cover. There's a lot that we're doing internally, and it's really good work.
And again, this comes back to that concept of journey. Like everyone's at like a different stage in their journey, and unless you're disclosing the data and you're being transparent, and holding people accountable, then people aren't going to know what's going on behind closed doors. Now, Khalil, you mentioned like a very interesting point to me in the brief intermission between the two panels, and I wanted to kind of like bring that in. You said, this is what I live and breathe all the time, all day. It's not. My CEO has a few other things to be thinking about as well. So how do you kind of weave that in? How do you kind of like bring this to a point of prominence and help kind of weave this into the fabric of everything they're doing from a strategic perspective, when you're right, there are so many other things to think about, but I do think that this is something which should underpin pretty much every element.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think in the former panel, we heard folks talk about this is just a core part of leadership, right? Ultimately, we've pulled it out because it requires a specific amount of additional energy right now. And we're seeing that with things like remote work as well. More and more companies are saying we need to hire a senior director of remote work because this is a specific thing that we need to pay attention to for right now. If we still have senior directors of remote work 5 years from now after we've been doing that, we're probably not making the progress that we should. And so ultimately, this work around diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, belonging is about being a good leader. If you can only inspire or attract or retain people that come from a similar background, you're a crappy leader at the end of the day, right? Like, let's just be honest about that. And yet, in this space, as I was saying to you, I view the vast majority of things in my world through this lens because this is the work that I do and the passion that I have. So when I'm on Twitter, I'm looking at the comments that someone has made and how does that impact a particular community and how might my ERGs be thinking about it and how, what research undergirds that. I'm not necessarily looking at it through a financial lens or through some other lens. And so knowing that my CEO has a particular lens and views the world in a particular way, my CFO has a particular lens and is looking at it in a particular way, part of my responsibility is to put those lenses on and to be able to meet them where they are in terms of what's important to them. Because if I'm only talking from a position of what's important to me, I'm talking past them or talking over them or talking around them. And so I think, in a lot of ways, one of the analogies that I use with our employee resource groups or when I'm having conversations is, it can become frustrating when you feel like people don't value the same things that you do. So I ask them like, hey, how many of you care about climate change? The vast majority of people will raise their hand. How many of you have been on a plane recently? Some people will raise their hand. How many of you have more than one car in your household? How many of you have eaten meat recently? How many of you live in a home that's bigger than you probably need it to be? How many of you have, purchased fast fashion or something that you probably won't have in a couple years? Now, again, that's not to blame anyone, but most of the people I know care deeply about climate change, and yet we have not made the deep, hard cuts to be able to actually change our systems because we're waiting for other people to do it, right? Or we're waiting for some sort of legislation, or we're waiting for something to push us. And if we're in that same place with something that is as kind of in our face as climate change, is it any surprise that as a leader you say, you know what, I do want to hire the people that I'm more comfortable with. I do want to be in a meeting where everybody says, you know what, Khalil, you're right. That's such a great idea, Khalil. I agree with you completely, Khalil. Right? Do I really want to surround myself with people that say, I see it differently. I have different information. Why did you make that decision? Especially when we're talking about leaders that have a history of success. right? They have succeeded in the vast majority of things that they've done. And so if I'm just kind of pushing this narrative of, because you eat meat, you're a bad person, and like, why wouldn't they just start to avoid me as opposed to engaging with me? And so the point is not necessarily to change beliefs, it's to change behaviors. And I love your point around, systems and holistic kind of operations, because those are the things that when you change the way you manage talent in your system, you change all of the downstream effects. Because on the prior panel, I said, time is the enemy of diversity. A lot of the research will show us so is being frustrated or hungry or rushed or tired. When we're in those spaces, our biases take over. But if you build a better system and you say, hey, when we're interviewing people, these are the types of questions we ask, not just, tell me a little bit about yourself, right? Getting to those better systems enables us to have better outcomes, and it just allows us to not need our leaders to pay as much attention to those things, because my role is to build better systems.
Yeah, I think it's such a good point, and you're helping, as you say, you're giving people the tools.
Yep.
It's not that I don't think it's that people have wanted to necessarily intentionally build organizations that weren't inclusive or weren't representative, that the board didn't think it was important, but perhaps didn't have the information or the tools to actually get there. So, when I think about that, I'm thinking about when we talk about leaders who get it, it's leaders who are able to sort of infuse doing good into their strategic agenda. Right?
Yeah.
Lindsey, do you want to share?
Can you
about
tell that I want to share? Oh my God! No, I am in vehement agreement. And Khalil, I agree. I do agree with you. I think that you're right. As you said, when it comes to the amount of things that we're all focused on at all times, it is our human instinct to default to safety, which is the things that we're comfortable with. Right? That's how we're literally wired. I think what's been really interesting for me to see at IBM is that we're lucky to have a CEO that is wired in a similar way. Arvind Krishna is our CEO, and I think that what's been really special about this early time in his tenure is that it's super clear that when he talks about his priorities, he also talks about ways to get those priorities done, and there's no confusion around whether diversity, inclusion, all things culture, all things growth, transformation, are things he puts his bet on around things that will make a difference. And so when I think about kind of what we're talking about in terms of its overall integration, in terms of the positioning of our leaders and the influence that they're expected to make, how we then influence them, it's been a really interesting partnership, a dance, I think, between IBM leaders and our organization from a D&I perspective, working together and making firm and hard decisions, tying compensation from an executive perspective to diversity and inclusion is a board decision ultimately, right? So those are the things that we see coming into play internally that are influenced by our broader leadership structure, but then also, I think, amplified by the day-to-day actions of leaders, managers who are showcasing success within these areas and really putting on display the work that they're doing. I think it's the visibility piece that's really made a major difference, and in giving the opportunities and to showcase is what our team's been really focusing on as well. How do I get as many leaders to talk about what they're doing personally around this space, but once we get those folks to tap into those personal experiences and those stories, we see them everywhere. But suddenly we find other ways for us to have that default to our personal experience be also applicable to what we're doing at work. And so I think Arvind is a really good example of that. He speaks monthly to our organization, and typically when an HR function gets a call out on a stage like that, we get really excited. I still get excited, but it happens very frequently. And I think those are the small changes that we see from a leadership perspective and big changes from a board perspective that have really allowed this influence to be kind of a community and all culture focus. So it's everywhere.
But as you say, him consistently mentioning, normalizes the fact that this is something which is really important to him, and therefore it should be important to everybody else.
When we can get a book recommendation from our cast, I don't know if any of you are familiar with that, but I recommend it. because Arvin recommended it to me, right? Then I mean, it's a win. That's huge. This is time and effort that he's putting in on his own to learn about the space, his own personal experiences that he's bringing to the table, and that trickles down to the other senior leaders in the organization, and then to managers as well, for sure.
Absolutely. Shelley, how's that transparency and accountability in your leadership team kind of helped, weave into KPIs as well?
It's been everything. It begins with choices, right? So one of the things that we say is we have built DE&I into our strategy. We haven't bolted it on, right?
Yeah.
When it's this extra thing, it's not core. When it's this extra thing, it doesn't count. When it's this extra thing, no one's held accountable for it. So we really build in. So you think about, we're a consumer goods company, right? So the way we create value is by delivering irresistibly superior products for our consumers. And so it begins with that. Like, it begins with us saying, so then what's required to do that? And what's required is that we reflect the diversity of our consumers and our talent base. What's required is that our brands and our brand builders know how to build brands with that diverse consumer base. It means that, so our holistic integrated strategy has 4 legs to it. It has employees, brands, partners, and communities. And we have specific action steps, specific level of intentionality, along with specific measurements of how we're going to measure success. And what I want to point out here is that the choices under, say, the employee umbrella, those choices were both, in the end, defined and agreed to by the CEO, and then a couple of really key people, myself, and given my role, the chief HR officer. And so the chief HR officer and I were looking at each other going, yep, this is what we're going to go and deliver. These are the targets that we're going to deliver in these segments of our employee base. We're going to deliver them by this point. These are the changes we're going to need to make to the talent system, et cetera. Our brand officer, Mark Pritchard, he owns those choices in the brand pillar.
Yeah.
The partner pillar, we have some really important targets and objectives and goals around supplier diversity, around our desire to reach 5 billion for women, another, by 2030. We have minority-owned business targets, et cetera. Those are owned by the chief purchasing officer. So I want you to know is my job is to work with the CEO and the leadership team to get this strategy on paper, but then translate it into action steps that ultimately have measures. And then those measures become what we hold ourselves accountable for. And those measures are connected to what's essential for the corporation to grow. Those measures are connected to talent, reputation, organizational health, the gaps we have with different groups of consumers and how we're going to fill those gaps, right? We're going to grow share because today we have share gaps with some of our consumer groups. And so that's the way to do it. And so it's part of the scorecard. I will tell you one last piece on this accountability thing is one of the drumbeats that we've done is that when we think about leadership in this space, we need to have clear expectations, clear accountability, and consistently build capability. Expectations, accountability, and capability. And that's why we still exist. There's a core of us that still exists in the DEI center. And so many other things, as you keep saying, it's about the chief influence. I'm like, I totally relate to that. My job, I say more than anything, is to get other people to do their job. Like, that's the thing I do every day, is I work to get other people to do their day job, but also ensure that the actions and choices and measures are built into their plans. And then we're all held accountable.
Absolutely. And I think it's that kind of, that alignment of strategic vision and values that helps to kind of like drive this concept of when we have resources and we're working with a matrixed organization, and there's no way that we can kind of have the sort of influence that we need alone and within our teams. How are we kind of like making sure that we're sort of pushing that vision out in order to secure the support of everybody else in the organization?
May I add a point?
Yes.
As a publicly traded company, one of the things that we have paid very close attention to is how our stakeholders and shareholders, particularly institutional investors, are viewing our company and what their expectations are of us as a leader in our space. And we do comply with the ASX governance principles for gender diversity. So we're looking at this annually, and we set metrics. But I think more importantly, we also broaden that out to our philanthropy so that it's consistent with what our core principles are as a company, and we also recognize that diversity really enhances profitability. And so I think making that tie to the bottom line of a company is very, very important.
Yeah. What would you add to that, Khalil?
No, I just love the notion. I mean, when this work is a bolt on, it's easy to bolt off, right? And so when we think about recession and inflation, and the leaders get busy, and there's a lot of other stuff going on.
Yep.
If it's not inextricably woven into everything else that is going on, then it's easy to say, well, we'll just pause on that. We'll do that later, right? I think the same thing happens. Chief influencer is incredibly important. Our roles still need resources, right? A single person out there trying to get in every meeting, do all of this work, operate at the strategic level with the board and the C-suite, but also at the tactical level with the employee resource groups and the challenges and everything else that's going on. So there are still resources required, and I love the notion. I'm fortunate to be the president of our Akamai Foundation, which is our philanthropic arm. Our board endowed it with about $20 million a few years ago, and then another $50 million. And through some smart investments, not clearly by me, we're up to about $80 million. And so we, grant about $3 million a year and are looking to do even more with that. So we'll probably up that to about $5 million. And we've done a lot of work over the past year and a half to really understand our purpose as an organization. And that purpose is really manifested in to make life better for billions of people, billions of times a day. Most people don't know Akamai, but as I say, on any given day, we're running about 30 to 40% of the internet's traffic. So security, safety, basically making sure information gets from point A to point B. And so we're incredibly inspired by that. And in some ways, it makes things like diversifying our workforce easier because the internet is incredibly ubiquitous, it's everywhere, but it's also at times a bit more challenging because a lot of the examples of good resources with our employee resource groups and things like that are to consumers, right? When Nike wants to understand, hey, how should we get into this market? They can go to their employee resource group. Or when, Pepsi wants to understand, hey, what's an interesting flavor? They can go to their employee resource groups. We don't necessarily go to our employee resource groups for how do we make a better internet. But we do go for how do we make a better employee experience? How do we make sure that this is a place where we are getting the best and brightest talent? When we're thinking about cybersecurity, it's not a particular demographic that is out there trying to break into our systems. It is everyone, right? And we know from the research that diverse and inclusive teams, that marriage of those things are more creative and more innovative. And so there are all of these benefits associated with it, but it does have to be woven in. It can't be a bolt-on, because if it is, it's just too easy to say, we'll get back to it later, we'll do it when we have time. And I think in so many ways, we've all talked about how fortunate we are that we have CEOs that are extremely committed to this work. Part of what I want to build is an organizational resilience such that one of two things happens. Either A, when our current CEO, Tom, who is one of our co-founders and is an incredible leader, when he decides the time is right to move on, the next person that comes in, there would be no question that this would be a priority for them. The other option is it wouldn't matter if it was a priority for them, right? Yeah. That it would be so woven into the fabric of the organization that they would have to become a part of that, in the same way that when you join a company, if you are very much not aligned with the values, it's almost like that tissue rejection, right? It's like, whoa, you can't be here. You don't get who we are. And so if we're continuing to rely on, we've got a great leader that cares about this, and so they give it budget, they give it airtime, they give it a responsibility, then at some point you may wind up with a leader who doesn't care about it in the same way. But whether it's the organization that changes the individual or the organization that says, hey, listen, if these things aren't important to you, then you can't lead this organization. And in some ways, we almost refuse to follow. I think that is a natural extension of this work that we're doing.
I couldn't agree more. I think that kind of strategic depth.
Can I add to that just a bit?
Yeah.
I think that those were huge points that you just made, Khalil. I think that one of the pieces that you were talking about around I mean, it's I would paraphrase to say you're talking about culture, right? And you're talking about how culture manifests itself within our organizations. I think that it's really, we're at a stage where you're completely right, right? There are wraparound services that have to happen around our inclusion efforts themselves to make them successful. And so if you continue to think about diversity and inclusion as this bolt-on with its own wraparound services, I mean, we're getting farther and farther from just the way we do things, right? And I think that that's been key. We've at IBM over the past year, we've done a lot of work repositioning, refreshing, and representing our culture, purpose, values statements. Throughout that effort, it's been all about how we continue to ensure that, yes, we're talking about our service, we're talking about what we provide, we're a client-focused organization, but also we're talking about the reality of the who makes it matters, we would say, right? The reality of the fact that the way the teams interact, our sense of belonging, are what makes us successful internally, and that's how we produce and provide better services. When we have, over the past couple of years at IBM, looked at our diversity and inclusion strategy, I have the privilege of having had an opportunity to sit in the D&I space in 2018, leave and do a couple of other cool things, and then come back now as a director in the space, and even just to look at the increased budget, my role existing now itself to come into, the senior leadership above me, starting with our transformation and culture SVP, a position that didn't exist when I was in D&I a couple of years ago. All of those kind of pieces of evidence are there as representative of our increased focus in the space, our sustained kind of efforts on a ground level, but then also the way that we've been able to operate within the industry at large, getting involved in more coalitions, external kind of partnerships and alignment with other organizations that are of a like mind and effort, things like 110, things like BRT, the New York CEO Jobs Council, et cetera. There's countless examples. I think all show how when we focus on what we're doing at home, then we can kind of amplify that into the world, and that really aligns very closely to our purpose as an organization. And so I just wanted to kind of give kudos and echo that purpose, that piece that you're talking about around this is how we do things. This is our way of working. Super helpful.
Yeah, and I think often I was speaking to somebody, she was very excited. I was speaking to a brand expert recently, and I said, I think in the advice that you give to many organizations, like, from the very beginning, that concept of building your vision and values into your brand shouldn't be overlooked, because that is what kind of really sort of draws people in, keeps them excited. And like, that investment from the top, that investment from leadership, like that's what you've got when you're seeing like more people come into DEI, when you're seeing like these programs pop up. That's an actual financial investment, which also comes back to the point that we were discussing earlier, which is even if there seemingly appear to be other priorities in the process for like senior leaders, like clearly this is something which they're invested in threading into every single piece of what they're doing within their role. So I'm always conscious that you want to leave a discussion like this, a very valuable discussion like this, with a piece of advice. I've got 4 fantastic experts up here. So as we think about like the next generation, and we've talked about the opportunities for us to go forward, but some of the challenges with the economy, et cetera, potentially pushing us back. What kind of one piece of advice would you give like the next generation of people who are either in the CDO space or adjacent to it or supporting it? What kind of piece of tangible advice would you give to them?
You're looking at me.
Yes, I am.
Oh.
I'm back to you.
Oh boy. It's simple to say, obviously very, very difficult to do. I have, before I joined Akamai, I worked at a consulting firm called Neuro Leadership Institute and did a lot of consulting with various organizations. The core thing that I brought to everything is build better systems. At the end of the day, there's like one article that I wrote, because I wrote a lot while I was there, that was don't change beliefs, change behaviors, right?
Yeah.
We spend a lot of energy, and I would work with a lot of leaders that would say, I care so deeply about this work. I've got daughters. I was raised by a single mother. I've got a wife whom I love dearly. And I would look at their leadership team, and it was all guys.
Yeah.
Right? I love that you care. I care more about what you do. And so when we talk about changing your talent systems, when we talk about changing the way you interview, when we talk about like all of these amazing things that we now know more than we did before, if you build better systems, you change the entire behavior of the organization. So that for me is the single place that we should be focused as leaders.
Exceptional. Joanne.
I would say lead by example with passion, principle, and energy. And be confident in everything that you do and you say.
Thank you very much. I like that. Shelley.
So, what I want to talk briefly about is the majority culture. Okay?
Yep.
And so, first, I want to start by saying, motivation for this work comes from many places. Generally, it's from sort of a human-centered sort of, I believe in the expansiveness, humanity, and the desire and the need to celebrate and include. That's one level of motivation. Another motivation is, there's sort of a moral authority of it's just the right thing to do, which sort of takes that one a little further. Another potential motivation is growth, right? Understanding that it's essential for growth of businesses, of communities, of people. I know that as a parent, the more diverse my children's friend group is, and they're way more diverse in their 20s than my friend group was, I see the growth of an acceleration of growth. So anyway, there's a range of motivations about what can bring people both to an understanding and a motivation of why this is critical work, and it needs to be built into everything.
Yeah.
I think we can all do a better job of finding a way to ensure that we get the majority culture to step up and lead.
Yes.
And wherever the motivation comes from, however it comes, but we still have the majority of culture in the majority of senior roles. We still have the majority, and when I use majority culture because that term varies depending on where you are in the world, who that means, but it always denotes male. Let's just start there. It's always going to denote male. And so that's what I'd say is, and that's one of the things that we're working through now is what do we say, how do we bring in that segment, and we need to hold them accountable, right, for helping drive change. And so that's what I think next generation of CEO and CDO leaders need to be thinking about. We're not going to make it without. I also would say that, sort of the social narrative that exists today and the polarizing of so many things, what I'm trying to tap into more is let me just say this. I was at a conference a couple weeks ago, and I was up, and someone said to me, hey, you have two people with you, and neither of them are a black or brown person, right, from your company. And I didn't invite the one person. I only invited one person. And I was like, I was feeling really great because I brought a white, straight, cisgendered male with me.
Oh, yeah.
And because most of my world is not that I work with day in, day out.
Right.
And they didn't, I wasn't going to respond that way, really, because that's not what would have been good. It would have been bad. But it was a reminder to me, once again, of one is I'm surrounded by, very often, more often than not, women, people of color, people from the LGBTQ community, et cetera. And I need to hear from and better understand the majority culture and what I can do to help hold them both accountable for making progress and stepping up and leading.
That's an extremely good point.
All great pieces of advice from everyone thus far. And it changes my piece that I was going to give. For those entering in this space, or for those who have been in this space for a long time, I think it's important to remember that you yourself are coming into the space with your own set of experiences, biases, privileges, and opportunities. But all that being true, the core piece of advice from me is that you can't pour from an empty cup, right? That's the idea of filling yourself up before you can feed into others. I think it's important for us to remember that. I think it's important to remember that we have to continue to fill ourselves up with things that comfort us, with education, with knowledge, with skills, right? Keeping ourselves sharp within our space, ensuring that we're not only relying on our personal anecdotes and experiences to drive a diversity strategy, but also, emotionally, spiritually, physically, all of those things are going to allow you to be able to show up and do this work that's hard but important, I think, to your fullest and best potential. But you got to start with yourself and then be able to fill up others.
Fantastic. Well, can everyone say a huge thank you to this panel? Seriously impressive insight, and thank you so much. Thank you so much for all of your input.